Hello everyone, welcome to YF I suppose. I'm out in my garden right now. It's super sunny, so if you hear any weird noises, it's probably something outside, so I hope you can hear me. And also my neighbours are gonna get a good wee bit of the gospel here, so it's a win-win situation. So as you know, we've been going through Philippians in our wee Zoom calls. So this week I'm just going to continue on with Philippians. And Andrew finished off last time at verse 11 of chapter 2. So today I'm going to read Philippians chapter 2, and it's verses 12 to 18, and it's titled, "Do Everything Without Grumbling." So it says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have all obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me." Okay, sorry for my awful reading. So I did some research online, because obviously we don't come up with these things off the top of our head, but I'm just going to share with you some points about this passage, and then at the end there's a couple of questions which we'll be able to discuss in our Zoom chats. So the first point in this wee section is the therefore. So anytime we hear therefore, that means that something has come before, which we need to take into account before reading this passage. So we need to look at the whole, what we've learned so far. So from chapter 1 verse 27 to chapter 2 verse 11, which is just where we left off, Paul has been encouraging the Philippians to conduct themselves in a manner which is worthy of the gospel. So he's been teaching them about unity, harmony and humility. And in those passages he was highlighting the example of Christ and his perfect obedience and his sacrifice. So now Paul urges them to put into practice what he's been teaching. So this wee section is now an explanation of how the church can put into practice all that he has been teaching before. So I've got a couple of headings that we're just going to go through. So the first heading is integrity. So Paul commands their obedience, and he wants it to be genuine and sincere. So the first verse, verse 12, is all about integrity. And often the church today can be called hypocritical, but Paul actually says the church in Philippi had integrity, and he commends them for it as well. So that's something that we should be working towards. So we need to have a faith that is more than just an outward show of values just to Christian people. We need a genuine faith in Jesus. That'll be the driving force for our whole lives, a force that'll shape our inner attitudes as well as our outward behaviour. So integrity is acting outwardly how we feel inwardly towards everyone around us, and not just chosen people. So the next heading I have is work out your salvation. So in verse 12, people often get confused because it says to work out your salvation. And throughout the rest of the Bible, throughout the rest of the New Testament, Paul actually teaches salvation through faith and through grace alone, not by our words and by our deeds. But what people forget to do is often look at verse 13, which says that God is the only one working within everyday believers in the church. Put my phone on silent. So God's purpose is that we are to be conformed in the likeness of Jesus. Paul wanted the whole church to be filled with spiritually mature men and women. God is the one working in us. Paul doesn't expect you to work out your salvation by yourself. That doesn't mean we don't have a job to play we do need to respond obediently to the promptings of the Spirit and cooperate with God's work. So we still do have a part to play. And Paul wanted the church in Philippi to work together and cooperate with God's work and to practice a mature, united community of believers. So that's what we're to be as well. So the next point I have here is with fear and trembling. So God is much more than just gracious and generous. Our God is also gloriously powerful, transcendent and holy. So it's in verse 12 again where he says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So God is the creator of the universe. He has tremendous power and benevolence. He is powerfully at work within us and working towards a wondrous, glorious gospel. So as we've often been told, we have to fear God, and it doesn't mean fear and scared, it means fear and reverence. So the next part I have is grumbling and complaining, and that's in verse 14. You might have heard it before. It says, do everything without grumbling or complaining, or grumbling and arguing. So this is actually quite practical advice from Paul in verse 14. And I don't know if you've noticed, but Christians can often have a pessimistic outlook, and Paul doesn't want this. Paul calls for joy. So I don't know how you're feeling at the minute, but I know that I'm certainly feeling a bit pessimistic about the whole situation. But that's not what Paul calls us to be feeling like. Even back in Moses' time, the Israelites were guilty of complaining and grumbling, and not only about Moses, about God. And Paul says to be wary about becoming too pessimistic. And we do face problems in life, and it's okay sometimes to be downbeaten about that, but we can't let that be what drives us. So he calls the Philippian society, also the society around the church, he calls them crooked and deprived. And this isn't an over-exaggeration. The society in that time was actually very, very bad. And often our society today can be like that. So in view of this crooked and depraved society, Paul calls them to shine like stars, which is my next point. Rather than hiding from the society around them and like retreating into their church and just being in a wee holy huddle, Paul wants them to shine like stars, which is in verse 15. So stars, although we can look at them and they can be bright and beautiful, in that day, when people looked at stars, they saw them as divinely created, and they showed that there was a harmonious order. And Paul wanted the Philippians to be this in society. He wanted them to be harmonious and that everyone around could see that they were divinely created. And also stars were used for navigation. So Paul was calling them to be a path to Christ, to lead people to him. So Paul wanted them to be light bearers in the world and be a witness for Jesus Christ. And Paul calls us, and God calls us to do that as well. And my last point, which comes in verses 17 and 18, is joy in the face of death. So Paul uses a lot of imagery here, which is seen throughout the Bible, imagery of altar sacrifices. And Paul, at the minute, in where he's writing, saw a real possibility that he was going to be coming to the end, and he was going to be coming to the end through martyrdom, and that he would die. And with his death in mind, he doesn't want the church to be sad about this. He wants them to be bold and joyful and continue in his ministry. So Paul wanted his ministry to have a lasting and eternal effect. His hope was that his ministry and labour would prove not to be in vain, empty or meaningless. He didn't want to go about doing all of this ministry for Christ and then it turns out that it was worthless and for nothing. And then at the very end, just at verse 18, Paul picks up again on the theme of joy and urges rejoicing in the face of death. So I hope that all makes sense. Paul's given the believers in Philippi some practical advice about how to be the church in Philippi. And this wasn't just practical advice for them in a time. We are still the church today, and we have this in our Bible for a reason. And that reason is that we can be able to learn lessons from it as well. And we can learn to be the shining light in our communities and in our societies. So the questions that you'll be doing later on, you can just think about them now. I'll read them out. The first one says, do your inner attitudes match your outward actions and vice versa? Number 2, is your faith in Jesus the driving force in your life? Number 3, what do you think is God's purpose for you and his purpose for the church? And the last one, are you shining your light, or do you feel intimidated by non-believers? So I hope that all makes sense, and I hope you are able to have good chats on your Zoom calls. Thank you for listening.